the second day of what has been a very rich and interesting conference for us, for the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. This has been a great learning experience by including study of the famines in Kazakhstan and China. We are as well adding today some discussion of North Korea, and indeed in our earlier discussions we saw that maybe even Ethiopia and other communist-controlled countries should have been discussed. The conference is organized by the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. It is co-sponsored by the Petro Yatsik Program for the Study of Ukraine at the Center of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, that's usually called CERES here at the University of Toronto, and the Asian Institute. And both of these are at the Munk Center of Global Affairs at the U of T. The Ukrainian-Canadian Research and Documentation Center, which is upstairs in this building, in the St. Vladimir Institute, which is also another of the institutions involved in the conference, and the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies have provided generous support for this event. The Holodomor Research and Education Consortium gratefully acknowledges the generosity of the Temertay Family Foundation. That foundation has funded the organization I keep mentioning, which we usually call HREC by its acronym. We have great hopes that there'll come a day not too long in the future when we'll be able to change that word consortium to center and to have a permanent center here in Toronto studying the Holodomor. Today we have an august panel of the many specialists who have been at our conference, which will give us some of their reflections on the proceedings yesterday and today. We are privileged that Professor Lynn Viola of the University of Toronto, a world-renowned specialist on the Soviet peasantry and the 1930s in particular, will moderate this panel. Professor Viola.
Okay. Oh, this doesn't work. Good afternoon. It's my privilege and my pleasure to be here to moderate this roundtable. What the organizers of the conference decided was that we're going to go in 3 groups, and each of our presenters will talk for about 5 minutes, then we'll open up for discussion, and we'll move on. So what I would like to do, particularly for those of you who weren't here yesterday, is introduce 3 speakers at a time who will go first. So in the first group will be Lucien Bianco, who is an eminent French historian and sinologist specializing in the history of the Chinese peasantry in the 20th century. My good colleague, Andrea Grazioso, who is a professor, also on leave, lucky man.
I'm leave for government.
Sorry. At Naples University. He's been here many times before, so he's truly one of those people who need no introduction. But I can say that in 2005, he was awarded the Order of Yaroslav the Wise for his studies on the Holodomor, and he is the author of many books on Soviet, East European, and Italian history. The third speaker in this group, who also, for many of you, needs no introduction, is Ludmila Hrinevich, from the Institute of Ukrainian History, the National Academy of Sciences, who is now the director of the Ukrainian Center for Holodomor Studies. So I wonder if I can ask Professor Bianco to begin and have about 5 minutes to present your findings.
Your findings.
As far as I can go. Okay. More wire or not? Okay, there we go. Okay, good.
We're not prepared for this.
Yeah, we didn't know.
Should work now.
The conference, what was the most important issue? What do you think is interesting that's come up our discussion? And what you
very thankful to the organizer. The conference was extremely interesting, and I learned a lot, and especially it's for me, as I during the last few years learned about the Russian Revolution, and so that it's all a new knowledge of the past a few years, which has been confronted to scholars who have worked in the field for decades, and that was tremendously useful and interesting. And I was very happy to see that some of my hypotheses were either confirmed or corrected by people, scholars who knew much better than I did, because of course outside of the China field, I am not at all a scholar. I'm just someone, we said in French, honnête homme who read about other scholars' knowledge and books. Thank you very much.
I might add that Professor Bianco has just finished a major monograph comparing China and the Soviet Union. So he's very modest when he says he was learning things here about the Russian Revolution. This study will come out in French, as it well should first. And we think in short order, like many of his books, will be translated into English, and they then form the field of Chinese studies. So it's, of course, extremely important that he has tackled this comparative topic.
Yes, of course, what Professor Bianco said applies to me too. I learned a lot, really, and I found the whole thing extremely interesting, so I'm very grateful. And I will try to say just a few things about what I learned and how can I conceptualize now this problem. Yesterday, at the end of Professor Bianco's very interesting lecture on peasantry and Chinese communists and Bolsheviks, Professor Hu asked the question, but what should I tell my student? Were the two famines basically similar or basically different? And of course, you know, there is the easy answer. They were both similar and different, and you have to study both similarities and differences, and which is, of course, a true answer. Because we historians know that everything is complicated. Yet it's true that one has to try to give one answer, not to. And I would answer at this point this way, if you allow me, yes, the 5 minutes I was given, that in a way it's basically the same, in the sense that the Chinese communists repeated the mechanism, the Great Leap Forward repeated the mechanism of the great turning point, of Stalin's great turning point, and this led to a major catastrophe they were not expecting. And this catastrophe, and this is already a difference, but the difference in scale was much bigger because Mao was much more an extremist in a way, and because China was much poorer than the Soviet Union was, and actually the Chinese Communist Party lost control of the situation completely. As you know, the famine in China made approximately 30 to 40 million victims in 2 years, so it was a really catastrophic result. So from this point of view also the difference is the scale, that is this general Chinese famine that was triggered by similar mechanism was much bigger than what we had in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, and here is the only place in the Soviet Union where these policies produced such a terrible disaster that nobody expected, was Kazakhstan. I will not deal with Kazakhstan, there are experts, but it's impressive to keep in mind that in Kazakhstan instead the results were even more disastrous in percentage terms, in relative terms, than in China. But I would say at this point that there was also a very basic difference. And the very basic difference, and this will lead me to the Ukrainian case, but it's not only the Ukrainian case, is that when Stalin started, this is Professor Bianco made me reflect upon this yesterday. Of course, in China there was no dekulakization. Because when the Chinese Communist Party launched collectivization, they did not expect to have a major confrontation with the peasantry. They thought that the peasantry were going to accept more or less, even if in 55, 56 they had resistance, they thought that this was not, they were not expecting this disaster, this peasant opposition. Stalin knew very well in 28, 29 that he was going to have a war with the peasantry, because he had experienced this in the Civil War. And instead we know that the Chinese communists had rose to power with the support of the peasantry and did not lose the support of the peasantry until the Great Famine, more or less so strongly. Instead, the Bolsheviks lost the support of the peasantry already in Russia in 1918, in Ukraine in 1919, recovered it only partially with the NEP, and never, in 1927, 28, they lost it again forever. And Stalin knew, so he started collectivization by attacking the peasantry. This is a major difference, because now we have a person that knows what he's doing. He's not expecting collectivization to produce a major catastrophe, but he knows that it's going to produce a major political crisis. The other big difference is that Stalin, of course, also knew that he had a big national problem. I have no time here, but of course the Ukrainian was the most visible and obvious, because in 1919 the Bolsheviks had been defeated, because the Ukrainian revolution was at the same time social and national, and Stalin in 1929 paid a lot of attention to keep the national and the social divided. He knew he was going to have a confrontation with the peasant. He didn't want to confront them also in the national term. So he left Ukrainization in place, for example. But one could add that also for Russian peasants, this was a national catastrophe, not only for the Ukrainian, by the way. The real thing is, by 1932, in Ukraine, again, the national and the social, in spite of all the effort of Stalin, were again going to be mixed. This was so evident by the summer of 32. Stalin, by the summer of 32, convinced himself, much before, this Terry Marty taught us, but this we discovered, that actually at that point the crisis was a national crisis. National not in the sense of the Soviet Union, in the Soviet sense, that is, there was a national component to the political crisis. And at this point, up to then, in Ukraine, there were maybe, according to Kulchitsky, 200,000 people had died from 28 to 32 of starvation, difficulties. It's a lot of people, but over 5 years with the kulakization, it is horrible, but still it's not such a huge tragedy as the Chinese famine, the Kazakh famine, or because also the Soviet Union started with a richer background in a way. It was a rich agricultural land. So the real difference at this point develops, and this I think, and I will finish with this because I will address this also in my lecture, is the decision that Stalin took at the end of 32 to solve the social and the national problem in Ukraine. This was after the Kazakh tragedy had happened already, was after the situation was close to stabilization in many Russian land. And we know that at this point there were about 3.5, let's say, millions dead in Ukraine in few weeks. This in, let's say, between April and June 33, combined with clear anti-Ukrainian decrees. They even changed the dictionaries, as you well know in the audience. They changed dictionaries, they changed the spelling, they kicked out all the intellectuals. The national communists committed suicide. So there was a very major national tragedy there that was rationally taught. I think this does not exist in China. So to give a final answer, I think there were major similarities, really. The mechanisms were the same at the beginning, but along the way, there were also very basic differences, and unless you grasp them, it's very difficult to understand what happened. Thank you so much.
Can we pass it? Thank you, Professor Graziosi. Dr. Hranevich will now speak.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the conference organizers Andrea Graziosi and Franz Thyssen, who served as the architects of this international gathering, as Marta Baziuk and Henri Macour, without whose dedicated effort this important meeting would not have taken place. Yesterday, over the past few days, we have continued an important discussion that was started here in Toronto a year ago at a conference marking the anniversary of the Holodomor. I am gratified that we are finally overcoming the less than desirable tradition of conducting academic dialogue around the topic of the famine, only as a tie-in to its latest anniversary commemoration. It's a very big progress. The conditions of creating a new intellectual platform based at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies in order to conduct such a dialogue were created thanks to the generous financial support of Mr. James Timotei, to whom we are thankful. I think that everyone will agree with me that the work done at our conference has revealed how important and promising to study of famine-related problems in its broad historical and comparative context is today. The insightful conceptual paper read by Andrea Graziosi, Nicola Vert, Lucien Bianco, Niccolo Panciotto, and other our colleagues have clearly demonstrated that the certain time during the 20th century, communist regimes resorted to the murderous use of famine as a weapon and tool for achieving their political aims, and that is these instances the principal cause of massive mortality from starvation lay not in natural disasters but in the politic of power, which David Marcus has defined as feminogenic policy. At the heart of the implementation of the feminogenic policies of the communist regimes in both in the USSR and China laid ideas that were key to the theory of Marxism and communist practices. But I would also like to address Professor Graziosi's conclusion concerning the special role of the central political decisions in the lead up to the Ukrainian and Kazakh feminists. It is, I think, it is entirely obvious that the Ukrainian and Kazakh situation in the early 1930s were similar in the sense that those two republics pressure that's common to all regions of the USSR, and which was a result that of the implementation of the communist experiment was augmented and intensified by a system of dependence on a center periphery vertical that cannot be understood outside the context of the imperial discourse. We know of quite a few examples of imperialist governments' feminogenic policy in the 19th and 20th century. the famines in Ireland and British ruled India, and the famines in the French and Belgian colonies led to the death of millions of people. Do those tragic examples of mass nation killers share any features in common with the situation that unfolded in the USSR in the 1930s? The Soviet Union, we know, was also an empire, not only communist country, and was communist China too. I would like to thank everyone for this fruitful discussion of the important scholarly problem, communism and famine. At the same time, I invite my colleague to continue this discussion, whose thematic field must be including and supplemented by a set of other several problems, as, for example, empires, nation, and famine, or by Bogdan Kali's proposition, state and famine, political decisions, or economic decision, and so on and so on. So I hope that such a discussion will be organized soon in Ukraine at the Ukrainian Center of Research on the Holodomor, which cooperate with HREC. We also hope to launch a discussion in the journal Holodomor and Genocide Studies, which is being prepared for publication. Thank you very much. It was very difficult, but I do it in English.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much.
You will do it again.
Oh, thank you.
Now.
No, it was excellent. I thought we would open up for discussion now till about 3 o'clock, and then we'd move on to the second round. Now, I heard that there was a very vigorous discussion this morning, and we can also continue that discussion. But at this point, I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, and ask you to step up to the mic. Would anyone, please? And please identify yourself when you speak, before you speak.
From the very beginning, I have only one question, big question. Maybe to Frank and to Andrea. Why the name of this conference consists the terms Soviet famines? If Kazakh and Ukrainian, it's not Soviet famines, what's the difference? What's the point of this? Thank you.
Yes, please come to the mic.
Oleg Romanishin. I was wondering if anyone could comment on how far the research has been advanced to compare the famine in the Soviet Russian Republic as opposed to Kazakhstan or Ukraine.
Are there comments or questions, or shall we turn this back to the table? We can only go to 3:15s, and we have 2 more groups. I thought we went to 3:30. Okay, so at this point, 3:00, that's fine. I think we can still go to 3. Yeah, okay. So let me turn these questions back to, I guess, first and foremost, Andrea.
Very briefly, because I think in the Soviet case, you have to distinguish between a general Soviet famine, and this general Soviet famine is the one that is very similar to the Chinese one, even though the Chinese one is so bigger and more complicated. And you know, Mao lost control of the country. Stalin never lost control complete of the country. Mao had to admit defeat. Stalin never admitted defeat. In 1934, actually, at this Congress of Victors, as we said yesterday. So it's not to deny that Kazakhstan and Ukraine were not part of the Soviet Union. But I would say that the mechanism and the dynamics of the famines in Kazakhstan and Ukraine are different enough from what happened in, let's say, the Volga region or the other places where there were important famines in the Soviet Union, beside the general one, to treat them as separate entities. Actually, I think that to recognize that they were separate entities is crucial to our understanding of the whole panorama. The other question, this is, the problem is Kazakhstan was part of Russia in 1931, 32, 33. Was part of Russian Republic, was not a separate. So again, formally one should actually speak of a Russian famine for Kazakhstan. But the difference is so striking when you study it that of course you cannot address it. As Niccolò Pianciola showed us yesterday, basically, in a very brutal term, one could say that the Kazakh famine was determined by the decision taken in Moscow to use Kazakh meat to feed the major Russian cities. So here you have really a mechanism of economic exploitation that is quite amazing. So, and if you take away Kazakhstan and the Volga region from Russia, and speaking the Russian Republic, then the famine in the Russian Republic is there. There are thousands that suffer of starvation, but there is no huge famine like in China. There is no comparison possible. That's why, again, you go back to the fact that Stalin more or less was able to keep control of the country, even at the end of 32, which was the most difficult moment. It's the only moment in which he thought maybe he was in danger of losing control of the country. So I think it is a very important, I finish with this, it's an extremely important, not only intellectual and analytical exercise, but to keep this thing different, and then first to understand them in their differences, and they put back together in a general picture is the only way you can understand what happened in the Soviet Union. Otherwise, I think you do not just get what happened, and you do not get the real importance and singularity of any of these terrible events. Thank you.
Would anybody else at the table like to respond?
Co-planner, not the table, but since it's addressed, I'll just say a quick word on it since we planned this together.
No plan.
Just the issue of separate as opposed to united with this. If Ukrainians have long wanted to see the Holodomor as totally separate from everything going on in the Soviet Union, that obviously is untenable in a scholarly manner. I mean, it cannot be studied that way. But I think there was another contending vision, both among scholars and even more among Soviet people of a certain sort, and they did exist, the Soviet people, which wanted to not see any distinctions. Perhaps would see the Kazakh possibly as a distinction. And when in the 1980s the study started in the West, there was great resistance to seeing Ukraine in any way different. And we can remember all of the dismissal of the idea that there could have been closing of borders in Ukraine. What those closing meant, but people just out of hand said that didn't happen, despite all the survivor testimony. And that would be an example. And then just to finish on that level and give back to the panel that rightfully should be speaking, I was stunned when I was in Yerevan for the anniversary of the Armenian genocide, and I went on television since they thought I would speak about Cambodia, and were surprised when I arrived there. They took whoever could speak Russian of sorts, and I wound up speaking about Ukraine. The insistence by Armenians that we suffered too in that way. Well, of course, Armenia did not suffer in that way. You can prove this. But the myth that all Soviet people have to experience everything in equality, I think still sits very deeply among many former Soviet citizens and don't see the distinction.
Yes, I don't know if it is exactly a response to your question, but when we compare the Soviet and Chinese famine, Soviet overall, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Volga and everything, we said we can basically compare them. They have the same causes, and once the famine was there, the same response of the government to famine. And yet, of course, we observe that in Soviet Union, the Ukraine was the most severely affected, and national question did not play any role during the Chinese famine. And secondly, that the Kazakh famine, every big powerful number of deaths in proportion to the population even bigger, and that in China, neither Tibet nor Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, nor Inner Mongolia with another national minority, the Mongols were severely affected. They are all among the less severely affected. So you cannot compare either Kazakhstan or Ukraine to anything in China, and yet you can very well compare, that's my opinion, the overall, the Soviet famine and the Chinese famine.
Are there more questions out there? Please come up. I do want to take advantage of my position as chair and to just throw out a question. And anybody on the panel who might have ideas can answer, or someone in the audience. But I'm wondering to what extent it might be useful to contextualize the Ukrainian famine within a larger period in the 1930s. I've sort of jumped from peasants to Great Terror, as it were, from the frying pan into the fire, or the reverse, depending on what we think. But it seems to me when we get to the Great Terror, all of a sudden the same themes that we saw in the Russian Civil War and the Great Famine come back again, same enemies. And so Stalin was in control, but sometimes he didn't know he was in control with his paranoia. And we see a whole nother struggle against what's called Ukrainian nationalism, Petlurists, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that there's some other aspect to this history that may well be worth looking at in the future, and that is this continuity into the period of the Great Terror. I'm sorry for taking your time, please.
Just a follow-up question. To what extent are the archives in Moscow available for researchers about the famine in the Soviet Union, given the current situation in the East? Thank you.
I'm wondering if we can ask, as well as the people who just spoke, Nicola and Sarah, perhaps,
Moscow, yes,
to talk a little bit about what's going on in Moscow archives.
Thank you. Yes, I did research in Moscow in different archives in the spring, and the situation was totally open. I mean, there was no difference between the access to documents they found earlier in comparison with the situation there was during the spring. As far as the Kazakh documents are concerned, but I did research about Kazakh famine.
Just adding to what Nicolo said, in the Kazakh archives, I would say the situation compared to other places in Central Asia is quite good. So the presidential or party archives are open, and actually in the last couple of years, they've undertaken a number of declassification projects. Many of these declassification projects include really important commissions that operated during the famine, party inspectorate commissions, and I think these have really helped our knowledge of what is going on. At the same point, I would add that there are still really important files and areas that are closed. One is, of course, the secret police. A few local scholars in Kazakhstan have worked in the secret police archives, and we've really benefited from their research, but they're not open. And various other things are still closed, like the personal file of Goloshokin, who was the leader of Kazakhstan during the famine. That is closed. And in general, we need more research. There are various things that are untapped. One thing I mentioned in my presentation yesterday was regional archives within Kazakhstan. And particularly in the case of Kazakhstan, which is a country that's the size of continental Europe, that's a really important aspect.
Don Cleve, I wanted maybe to give a bit of an explanation as to the national interpretation of the famine in Ukraine and why maybe there's been such an emphasis on this. The evidence shows that, of course, Stalin interpreted the famine in a national way, I guess, in the second half of 1932, and there are documents that support that interpretation. But as well, in Ukraine itself, I think there's evidence to show that Ukrainian intellectuals saw it as a national tragedy. And then there is the diaspora that right away, and Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, interpreted it in a national way as well. And of course, you have to look at the experience of failed statehood, the fact that there were Ukrainian intellectuals that lived in Europe in the interwar period and were political exiles. Then, after World War II, you had the emigres who published memoirs on the famine and who were politically active themselves. So there's certainly that element of focusing on this as a national tragedy and as an event that has a national meaning. Perhaps it might be overemphasized at times, but I think this has to be understood by the scholarly community, that there's a good reason for it. It's also due to the diaspora that you have Robert Conquest's first book that comes out, first scholarly study of the famine, when prior to this it was, if not ignored, it was poo-pooed, I think, by the academic community.
Shall we keep going on and go to our second group of scholars? I'm very happy to introduce. Does this microphone work?
No, it's the one that gets carried.
I think so.
You gotta get past it. Sorry.
Yeah. We're going to just move on because we're going to stop at 3:15. But I'm very happy to invite Sarah Cameron and Nicola Panciola to speak now. And particularly happy because these are two people I've wanted to meet for a while. I've known Nicola for longer because I think he's a little bit further ahead of Sarah, but both are relatively young scholars who have done really exciting new work, and so I'm happy to send the mic down their way.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So I'm a scholar of the Kazakh famine, and in my presentation yesterday, what I tried to do was I tried to give us, I think it's helpful when considering these cases, to think about what we do know, what are some of the kind of agreed upon facts, then to talk about how the understanding of the disaster developed in its immediate aftermath, and through the Soviet period, how understanding of the disaster has developed in Kazakhstan today, and then last, how various studies in the West have contributed to our understanding. And I concluded by saying, there are a lot of things about this particular case, the Kazakh case, that we don't know. And I tried to point out where different areas of research remain. So keeping in mind the directive to think about different themes in the conference that have been coming together, is that what you want us to speak about? Okay, so I'll just add a couple things that had been going through my mind to the mix about themes that we might consider. So of course, given the title of the conference, given some of the other themes that have been coming up, one theme that did occur to me is, of course, comparisons. And I raised this comparisons both between, of course, the Soviet famines and the Chinese famines. But throughout the conference, we've been bringing up other comparisons, whether you can use empire as a means of comparison. And earlier also, we might return to this, other people have raised the issue of temporality. How did these various famines, how did they depart from famines that preceded them? How did people draw upon earlier survival strategies, and so on? A second theme that we've been looking at a lot in the conference is, of course, the theme of memory. We have talked about official memory, state-supported memory, but we've also looked a lot at kind of popular memory, popular representations of the disaster. And the third theme, I think, that we've been all circling around is the theme of intentionality. So who knew what, when, how can we characterize Stalin's intentions? How can we characterize kind of Mao's intentions? What were the different flows of information like in these cases? We've talked about this both on the higher level, but also on the lower level. There have been debates about whether you can use the term of sort of weapons of the weak. And more broadly, we've talked, I think, and we should talk again, about how to characterize the aims of these various regimes. There's been discussion of, should we use the term kind of modernization? Was it a modernization? What type of modernization? Was it transformation? So these are some of the themes that I've seen emerging.
Can I'm sorry I neglected to do a full introduction in my excitement. So I just want to say Sarah Cameron is Assistant Professor of Soviet History at the University of Maryland, College Park. And Nicola is Associate Professor of History at Lingnan University, Hong Kong. Forgive me.
Thank you. I take this roundtable as a moment where we can try to make connections, even if these connections will end up being a bit tentative. As somebody who studied the Kazakh family like me, and I only obviously read secondary literature about the other two famines that we're comparing here. But one thing that struck me in these 2 days of discussion and presentations is that the one big difference is the relatively less importance of forced population movements. For the Chinese case, at least, we don't have something like decolonization or peasant deportation of 2.3 million peasants between 1930 and 32, something, of course, that Professor Oyola wrote about recently in her last book, I think. And in connection to this, I think this is an interesting point because, of course, the famine in Kazakhstan was happening at a moment where tens of thousands of peasants were being deported into Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan was an area of deportation, of course. And these people had to be fed, or at least many of them died. And thinking about this deportation issue, one thing that came to my mind is how much, in comparative terms, the Maoist leadership and the Stalinist leadership were thinking in terms of the older patterns of agricultural developments of China and the Tsarist Empire. In the sense that another striking difference is that the importance of waterworks projects during the Great Leap Forward, which is quite absent as a major factor in mobilizing labor during the Great Term, so-called, of the 30s in Stalinist Soviet Union, and so the carrying away, the bringing away labor from agriculture into waterworks projects, dams, canals, etc., had an impact in the decreasing of productivity in Chinese agriculture. The question that I have for the Chinese specialists here at the table, and it's how much because we know, of course, that the decision of deporting the peasantry in Soviet Union was a way to subjugate the peasantry more than to colonize the areas in Central Asia or Siberia, right? And then became a colonization project on the way, so to speak, right? But still, this was the traditional extensive project of agricultural expansion that was the Witte model, if you will, the Stolypin model of the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And of course, we know the importance of water work, of water control and river taming for the Chinese agricultural development. So, this is something that is, I think, it's a comparison that, in my opinion, would be interesting to pursue, also because the Great Leap Forward came only a few years later from the Great Stalin Plan of Transformation of Nature, from 48 to 53 in the Soviet Union, that has been studied mostly in connection to afforestation projects, but one other big important part of it was extensive irrigation projects, especially in Central Asia. So I wonder how this had an impact in, as if during the Great Leap Forward there was both collectivization and the communalization and a great plan of transformation of nature at the same time. So I believe it that way.
Thank you. I wonder any responses from the panel or continuing questions, comments from the audience. Please come up to the mic.
In connections between extensive irrigation projects in USSR. Yeah, and the Great Leap Forward.
I'm not that familiar with the, let's say, the economic background of research that's been done on the broader theme of the transformation of modes of production in Europe and elsewhere from the beginning of what was the initially primarily Western European and British change to industrialized production, be it in factories or even on what nowadays contemporaneously would be called factory farms, highly industrialized farms, and how this affected what would have been initially very large pools of rural labor that were needed for, what had, been very ancient ways of doing farming, and how that labor became, in effect, superfluous as industrialization increased. This labor would tend to move to urban centers seeking industrial employment in Western Europe, and then what ensued would be the horrors of early capitalism with extremely harsh conditions for these relatively unskilled laborers. They became a reserve pool of labor, which at the same time was extremely vulnerable, with high unemployment, with, as I said, harsh working conditions. In Western Europe and in Britain, it seemed that, and in the early days of the United States and Canada, it seemed that this transition was relatively slow compared to what happened in the former Soviet Union, China, etc. But it would seem that there might be this broader schema of, initially extremely large pool of rural agricultural labor that is transitioning to the newer industrial mode of production, and then of course now post-industrial. And what happens to that labor, how vulnerable they become. And it seems to me that there might be this theme that in the former Soviet Union, China, this transition was excessively harsh and made this pool of labor exceedingly vulnerable, even vulnerable to extermination. It seemed that whether it was intentional or just as happenstance, that's of course a huge argument, but has this theme been explored, how what happened here might also be seen in this broader context of this general shift from pre-industrial, largely rural populations to industrial, and how they became vulnerable? Could it be inserted into this broader scheme? Are you familiar with areas of research? Perhaps Dr. Pinciola? It sounds to me as though this might be something that you would be quite familiar with. I'm wondering.
Not really. Maybe you want to.
Would anyone would you like to?
No, that's really very.
Well, I think it's a great question, actually, but I don't think it's an easy one to answer. And
I would think about it.
Although he's reluctant, I think Nicholas Wirth probably could say one or two or three or four things about this. But, it seems to me that we have some understanding of some of the politics and some of the sort of social aspects of this. If you look at works by David Shearer and Paul Hagenlow, who are able to sort of look at the chaos generated, the social chaos generated by collectivization, the forced and the unforced migrations into cities. And so there's a little bit, but people have been reluctant to compare it with Western Europe. Yes, please.
One of the issues that I'm interested in, I'm a student here at the University of Toronto in political studies, is the level of awareness of the famine in this country and on this continent. David Marples talked about it briefly at the last conference. He said that in the 20s there were letters to the Winnipeg Free Press about this. But this question of the famine affected our policy here in Canada and the United States. Shortly after the First World War, we had internments of people who had emigrated to Canada from these Slavic countries who were under suspicion. And I'm wondering if that had an effect in terms of repressing the awareness of this issue. There were organizations in the United States, the American Relief Association, and others, religious groups, that did have direct contact with the Ukraine. And I can tell you for a fact that there are at least 6 people in the Kitchener-Waterloo area that had direct knowledge of it because they were my family. So the issue of awareness in Canada of this issue is something that I think has been, has been kind of passed over. On the question of government policy, we do know that Pierre Trudeau was traveling in China in '61. We know that. He's obviously well aware of the situation regarding the hunger situation in China. Obviously, would know it well.
Now he does, but he didn't then.
Pierre Trudeau.
Yeah.
He's no longer with us.
He's no longer.
Oh well, I mean, yeah, I understand that, but he, yeah.
Because he did do a tour through China, but yeah. there was government policy with respect to wheat sales to China by Nixon and by this government. But what did Mackenzie King know about it? What did and how is it perceived? This, I think, is something that should be teased out. Because there's like a political amnesia here on many issues. And it takes a long time to get this government here in our country mobilized to get behind any kind of awareness, as you probably know reading the current newspaper.
Yeah, okay. Andrei Mokuch, please. Yes.
I'm in the Cold War Research and Education Consortium as well, with the CRUEL, the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. In fact, in Canada, there was a widespread awareness of conditions in the Soviet Union. Currently, we are doing a search of major Canadian newspapers for content regarding specifically the famine in Ukraine / in the Soviet Union overall, as well as general Canadian policy, agricultural policy. Canada was a big wheat producing country. They were dependent on on markets. So this is being researched. It was fairly well known. It was perhaps better known than you might suspect, and very interestingly enough, later there seems to be a significant drop in knowledge. But certainly, what we discovered in the Edmonton Bulletin, Winnipeg Free Press, Winnipeg Tribune today has certainly shown that yes, this was there was a lot of material about this in period.
Thank you. I think we have some responses to various questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, first about that question, you said, the gentleman said that Pierre Trudeau obviously knew if he went to China in '61. So, but François Mitterrand, the French future president, went to China and knew and understood nothing. And famous French intellectuals like Simone de Beauvoir went, I did not understand and saw anything, see anything. Yeah. But I'm sorry, it was mostly a belated answer to Nicolo, but I'm sure I understood your question. If your question is comparing expansive irrigation project in China and others in Kazakhstan or in Soviet Union, I have not much to say, except that, of course, Mao was imitating what he felt had been done in Soviet Union, not more. But if there were some expansive irrigation project, definitely, and on a powerful scale. So tens of thousands of people, of peasants, went far away from home for months, you know, and working on gigantic hydraulic project, irrigation and others, and they worked with their hands and primitive tools, and they work on many small-scale projects conceived by peasants with no engineer, and the main work was done with earth, and of course they did not last long. It was a waste of time and money and work of those poor peasants. And when it lasted, sometimes the consequence was salinization of soil. And the very few big-scale projects that lasted, of course, we cannot but remind that one of them in Honin province, the dam broke out in 1975, and there were 3 times as many people died from that accident, from the broken dam, that from the 2008 earthquake in Sichuan province. And by that time, of course, women were remaining alone to do the agricultural work in the village, and because they were liberated from the kitchen and cooking, so and of course, at the same time, they were working on the backyard furnaces. Thank you.
May I add something? Since the lady asked me directly the question, I just want to, unfortunately I'm not a specialist of this kind of processes in Western Europe, so the comparison is interesting, but what I can say is that you have to bear in mind that one of the crucial aspects of collectivization in the Soviet Union, at least, was the severing of the urban-rural labor nexus that existed before the revolution. So I know there are studies about industrial labor in Russia before the revolution that highlights how much these former peasants that work in the factories were still linked with the village. And so one of the effects of the collectivization was, of course, that instead the migration and urbanization of the 30s was a final severing of these nexus that existed before. And so this is one of the important things.
Yes, I have 2 remarks. One about what Nicolo said about the Stalin's great project of transformation of nature. And there, I think we go back to this very big question. We cannot answer it, but I think it's very right to raise it, about what Mao knew, Mao meaning also the Chinese leadership, knew about the Soviet experience. And this means also being aware of the success of Stalin's misrepresentation of Soviet history. Because by the middle 50s, even in the Soviet Union, only the very top leaders knew what had happened during collectivization. Yeah, but the general picture,
but
it was covered because
your parents are from the
no,
country.
yes, but you didn't have the general picture. You knew the experience of your. The general picture was completely lost because the idea was that the 1922-33, that had been a disaster, even economically, had been a great success. So this is what the official ideology said. And so, and Khrushchev, I repeat, in 56, did not denounce the pre-1934 Stalin. So the idea was this was a great success, an unqualified success. And this is what Mao possibly knew, that there had been such collectivization, and this had been a great success. And in fact, when you thank to Lucien, when you read what Stalin was imitating, he was not certainly imitating what happened in 1928-30. He was imitating the official Soviet discourse, plus the late Stalinist discourse, meaning the great project of transformation, or meaning Khrushchev, you know, we will reach and surpass the United States, and we have the Sputnik, and there was also this last, let's say, bout of socialist hopes at the end of the 50s that were very important. As to the question that was asked, I think the answer is no, basically. That there is no similarity, that the differences are much bigger. Because when you, already Niccolo started to say something, but let's say after 32, with the introduction of the internal passport, this is precisely the contrary of what happened in Europe with modernization. This was a real cut in the relation between the city and the countryside. In order to work in the cities, you had to get, you know, a passport and then a propiska. It was not easy. Only after World War II it became easier again. And in China it was even more tragic. We know that in China, after the Great Leap Forward and the ruralization of 20 million people in 61, 62, about, if I remember correctly, 11 million people were sent back in 61 and another 8 in... 20 million people were sent back. This never happened in any country in the West. And between 1961 and 1975, the proportion of rural and urban residents in China remained the same. So this is really the differences. And even if you think the more moderate experience, like the Eastern European one, what is striking with collectivization is how much this preserved the rural world. In Italy, when the real development happened in the 50s and 60s, in the space of 15 years, the rural world disappeared completely. There were no peasants left at the end of the 70s. They were gone. In these countries, even in Poland, there was still a very lively rural world. Lively, was badly damaged, but was still there, very, very present. So I would say, really, of course, it's the more general process. All these societies were becoming more urban. This is, of course, true. But I would say that what strikes me is not the similarities, but it's the difference, personally at least.
I think we have at least... Oh, okay. But I would ask, there are 3 people who have raised their hand. Please come up to the microphone, and so we have a list going.
No, I just want, about those 20 million people that Andrea just mentioned. So, of course, this was awful. Those people had been sent, or almost sent back then from the village to the cities in that big rush of industrialization. Some, of course, of them came wholeheartedly themselves, but others were incited to them, and a few years later they were sent back to the village. But at the same time, that awful fact was very, very helpful to win the famine. It was what was needed, what was to be done, you know, because that was finally the most cautious and wise of the Chinese leader. Chen Yun who had been against the Great Leap from the very beginning, who had been discarded, but who came back and he said, we need to do 2 things now. To ask those people who came to the city back to the village, because we will need them to feed with grain collection from the village. They will manage among the village, I don't know how, but at least there will be ever more producer of grain, at least less people who consumers of grain in the cities. And at the same time, Shen Yun said we need to import grain, and very quickly. And I guess the end of the famine might very well have been the consequence not of a good crop in 62, but of those two facts, calling back these people who had been sent to the village and importing grain.
I would like to say very shortly about very complicated and very important question. What people knows about the Holodomor, for example, in Ukraine? I don't know how it was in China, but in Ukraine there was a lot of sources of this knowledge. It's from mouth to mouth, it's rumors, and a lot of another. And as said about these NKVD documents, people speak in this period in the end of 30s, maybe even during the Soviet-Polish War, when the Soviet soldiers, Red Army, to see the Western society and to see the Lviv and Chernovitsi shops, and they compared with this with Soviet Union, and they say about the millions dead during the Holodomor. They said about the great tragedy in Ukraine. They said the guilty of Stalin and his lieutenants. And I think it's the question very interesting. Soviet Ukraine know about the tragedy of Holodomor. Thank you.
Please identify yourself as you speak.
Diana Kudebrigena, I'm a sociologist from the University of Cambridge, and I want to ask another provocative question regarding the ideology, because the conference is called Communism and Hunger. And my question would be something that has been circulated, both in the countries. For example, I'm working on contemporary Kazakhstan and contemporary Ukraine, and a lot of people were using the words like colonization, internal colonization. What's the ideology of that time? Okay, let's forget the violence and fear. Was the ideology kind of a reverse of this internal colonization from the historical point of view? Because I can talk about the contemporary historic kind of, and there are some strong connotations on that in terms of the popular, as you say, popular history and stuff. But I'm really interested in your opinion. Was this a violent act in some sphere in China, in Kazakhstan, or in Ukraine, as something as internal colonization, or something that turned out to be internal colonization?
So the colonization issue, of course, your question is both about Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Well, in terms of Kazakhstan, it's interesting because Kazakhstan was the area with present-day Kyrgyzstan, at that time called Kyrgyzia, where the most aggressive decolonizing policies were implemented by the Bolsheviks when they reconquered the region militarily in the 1920. So in 1921, 1922, we have expulsion of tens of thousands of Slavic settlers that actually fought for the Bolsheviks. They were self-labeled Bolshevik fighters during the Civil War because there was a problem of appeasing the region, because the region came out of 4 years of violence between Slavic settlers and Kazakhs, as you know very well, especially in Siberia and Jetysu, so Kyrgyzstan and southeastern Kazakhstan. And after that, precise, very specific kind of anti-colonial reforms were implemented, that also symbolic reforms, like destruction of monuments linked to Tsarist colonization, like changing of names. Of course, Vierne became Almata, and other change of names. Semiriyeche became Jetysu, etc. And then immigration, agricultural immigration from Russia was outlawed in the 1920s. I mean, from outside Kazakhstan, not only from Russia, but most of the migration came from Russia and Ukraine. So one of the main aspects of the Great Turn was that immigration of peasants were made legal again in 1929 for Kazakhstan. And this was a major turnaround. And of course, the colonists turned out to be mostly deported peasants with the so-called decolonization in 1930 and 31. But so you can make the argument that this was a new wave of. For sure, I think that for sure, in the mind of the Kremlin, this sending people to Kazakhstan, right, was thought in the same way as expanding the agricultural lands, expanding the tilled land in the region. So in the sense of colonization, in the sense of turning land that was used by less productive herdsmen into land by more productive agriculturists. So certainly this fits into the definition. On the other hand, there was this a process of integrating the Kazakhs into the state that was, as I already said yesterday, that was very different from what was happening before the revolution. So of course Francine Hirsch, in her book about the ethnographic knowledge in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, made this point about how the different concepts of colonization were interpreted, and so the colonization was detached from the movement of people from the center of the state to the peripheries, and instead became was kind of left to the earlier meaning of economic development of less developed areas, and instead was coined the new term kolonizatorstvo that was instead right against this. And actually, people from at the beginning of the 20s, specialists of the Kazakh region. We're saying that we have to use the mass of Kazakhs that have been impoverished by the famine of 1921-22 as the subjects of this new kind of colonization. So, and people in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia don't have to be afraid of this new colonization, because it's very different from the old colonization. So definitely they have the word, they use the word, they try, and then they were of course conscious of the layered meaning of the word, and they were trying to use that in a new way. But I think that as historians, we are legitimate we can legitimately use the idea of colonization for what happened from 1929 on. Sorry.
Can I respond briefly to you? I think it's a really good and a really important question, and I don't like to refer people to Stalin's writings very often. It's not happening anymore. But yes, I should, and I knew Andrea would agree with me. But Stalin said the peasantry is going to be like our colony, and so he did talk about colonization in that sense, which does not contradict anything that Nikolai said. But I should also say that there was an institution that used the word colonization and colony quite frequently, and that was the NKVD, the secret police. They made use of both of the Gulag and all its manifestations as a force in what they called colonization. So I think it is a very important question.
I think Lynn is perfectly right. But the important distinction was between private and public discourse at the top, not at the bottom. Then I will speak about what. The problem is that the official discourse on collectivization, of course, was not a discourse on colonization, because Stalin spoke of internal tribute in private, in the Central Committee. In the published writings, this collectivization was going to bring benefits to the countryside. The official discourse never incorporated the element of colonization. This must be it's very important. It's the same for the relation between peasants and collectivization. We know that in his private letters, Solzhenitsyn would tell Stalin, we will attach peasants to socialism only with shades, right? This is what they thought. But you don't find this in the public statement. In the public statement, the Kolkosniki loved collective files. So I think, and this brings me, and the same is true about, for example, the period 1928-32. In public discourse, this is a great economic success. We know that they knew this was a terrible crisis. The problem is, and this is not, I understand your point, but the problem is by the beginning of the 50s, the official discourse predominated the intellectual community. If you read books in the West, in the Soviet Union, in Poland, in China, you read about official discourse. You did not read about what people knew. And so I think that when you address this, that's a very important point, that is in a way the official lie penetrated so much, even the elite discourse in a way, that very few people at this point, even Stalin, with his friends, would tell you we imposed a tribute on the countryside because this is our inner colony. But by the 1950s, Khrushchev didn't even believe this was possible. This is my point. So I think you have to distinguish very much, and they produced such a lie that became a success also internally. They were not cynical about the lie, I think, in the late 50s. I don't think Khrushchev, yes, in the 50s, no, before, yes, but on the long run, they became, the lie permeated themselves too. I think that Khrushchev is the perfect example from this point of view, that he believed he wanted the good of the people. When you read his memoirs, his internal documents, the discourse he was having, he knew that there had been bad things, but the system was good at the end. He believed this. I don't know, maybe Nicola disagrees, but this is my impression, that Khrushchev really believed in the goodness.
Well, no, I agree completely. When you read the Swotki of the 1970s or the 80s, well, all this lie is completely integrated in, and so that's what makes so complicated to interpret all it. And a question about colonization, yes, of course. Well, we know the project of Yegoda in the beginning of 1930, even just to make the Gulag a form of colonization. So there was a question in terms of saying, well, are we going to continue the Spetsperesiliense or the Gulag? So it was absolutely central, but again for internal use, and as Nicolo said, the Francine Hirsch told how explained the multi senses of this term.
Olga?
Olga Andrielski, Trent University. Sarah brought up the whole issue of memory yesterday, and I guess I'd like to ask a short and perhaps a diabolically simple question. You talked about this yesterday. Why isn't there more public commemoration of the famine in Kazakhstan? And I want to ask the same thing of the China specialist. Why isn't there more public commemoration of the famine in China? And I'd like to direct the third question to Ludmila. How do you think the Holodomor and the public commemoration of the Holodomor is going to play out in the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis?
Why no public commemoration of the famine?
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, I'll just reiterate some of the answers I made before. So yesterday I talked a little bit about the subject of the Kazakh famine. I noted that in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when public discussion of this surfaced, there was a huge presidential commission that investigated. The commission under President Nazarbayev ruled it was a genocide, but then by the late 1990s, they really backed away from this issue. When I was researching my dissertations, as I said, I would ask local historians questions about it, the Femme, and they would say, no, we've solved all that, no need to work on it anymore. The idea that you could ever, really solve historical problems interesting. But yesterday I listed, I think there are a couple reasons for it. One is, of course, Kazakhstan's relationship with Russia in terms of population. There's still a large Russian community in Kazakhstan. Political relationships, economic ties with Russia. Another reason that sort of came up in my discussions with local historians is I would ask them, what they would tell me really that they would discuss that they really sort of hadn't come to terms yet with what the Soviet past was for them. So they'd say, well, in Kazakhstan we were nomads before, but now we're a modern society. So I think in that sense, in Kazakhstan, there's still a rethinking and a reworking of the Soviet past and what it's meant that hasn't really been totally thought through. It's still a very, very contentious issue how to frame it. And Nicolo actually brought up a really interesting point, which I think is also worth mentioning from our discussion yesterday. He talked about the size of the Kazakh intelligentsia, and it's still, Kazakhstan is, and I think he's right in this regard, is still a society where a lot of people know each other. It's very interconnected, and people don't want to reveal nasty stories about someone's grandfather when they know the grandson. So I think that was also a really interesting point.
Okay.
Just a second.
About your question, why no public commemoration of famine in China? This is a good opportunity to correct something we said yesterday. In answer to, I think, a suggestion from Andrea, there was no longer denial of famine as early as 1979 or 80 in China. That's true. That was a direct way of criticizing Mao without saying so explicitly and opening a new way. Okay, but on the whole, there is only silence. A public commemoration of famine is just simply impossible to conceive in China now. There is never a mention of famine in China in official media, and with very, very few exceptions, there are only official media. So it's just no word about the famine. So we were very far from conceiving the possibility of official commemoration.
Can I add, and then I'll pass it to you? Okay, yeah. I would just add to that, I think we have to remember that China today is, it is the same regime that was in power, right, when the famine occurred. It's a one-party state, and the Chinese Communist Party has continually ruled China since 1949. Many people who were in power when the famine took place are now dead and gone, including Deng Xiaoping. Nonetheless, the party's legitimacy itself, despite the fact that it used the famine indirectly as a kind of criticism of Mao and as a kind of reinforcement of its difference with the Maoist era, nonetheless is the same party. And so for there to be any public commemoration, in a sense, is to cast a very strong spotlight on some of the gravest problems and weaknesses within this one-party system. And I would say that is one of the biggest reasons why you would not see any public commemoration. Now, that being said, and I think as Professor Zhou will say further in a minute, but there are a number of scholars and intellectuals who've been working on this issue in mainland China. Most of them aren't able to publish freely on their work in the mainland. Some have been able to, including Li Rui, I think, who's an important example of a former party leader. And Yang Jisheng, of course, but in Hong Kong. And so there is important work being done. Some of it does manage to get published in mainland China, but most of it has to be published outside. And so, there's just very little knowledge or understanding, particularly among young people today about the famine that took place.
I'm going to move things along a little bit. Dr. Kranevich will respond, and then we're going to go into our next round. And those of you who have questions, hold them because we'll have time for them afterwards.
Very short. Last year we had a very difficult dialogue with our colleague from Russia. It was very difficult dialogue about Holodomor, but we had it. But now we have war, and we have not dialogue with our colleague. And now I think we have only propaganda. Такою є реальна ситуація. Ми не маємо діалогу з нашими колегами з Російської Федерації. Ми втратили багато друзів, котрих ми знали, повірте, 30 років. Тепер ми тих друзів не маємо. Зараз війна в Україні, і зараз науку заступає пропаганда, ідеологія. І я вам скажу, як колишній воєнний історик, на жаль, на превеликий жаль, очевидно, на сьогоднішній день в умовах України питання пропаганди є більш важливими, ніж питання академічної науки. Пробачте, я академічний науковець, але це так.
Але на народному рівні, чи ви думаєте, що як буде День Голодомору в листопаді, що, наприклад, в Харкові, в тих місцях, де майже не відзначався Голодомор,
саме в Україні,
що
державна політика однозначно помінялась зараз, тобто державні заходи будуть скрізь. Якщо говорити про масу населення, ми живемо в умовах війни. І зараз всі думки людей обертаються довкола війни, смерті. І я думаю, що саме сьогодні, саме в цей момент, апеляція до історичного минулого в свідомості маси людей, вона відступає перед загрозами, котрі постають перед нами кожного дня, коли наших сусідів, дітей наших друзів вбивають. Зараз абсолютно специфічна ситуація в Україні. Війна.
So the summation of the situation is, on the one hand, there was a dialogue last year with Russian colleagues. That dialogue has stopped. In a time of war, it is particularly sad now that people with whom Ukrainian scholars worked for 30 years and viewed as their friends, those ties have broken down now because of the war. Then the further up on question was, yes, but what will this mean in November when the famine commemoration days come? And Dr. Kranevich said, well, you know, in a time of war, although I'm an academic historian, in the end I realized propaganda becomes all important. Although the government obviously has changed and now wants the commemoration of the Holodomor and will want it in the future, for the average person who's worried about the life of children, what will happen with the war, it's hard for them to think of historical and other issues, and the war takes over all.
Thank you, Frank. I'm going to move along, but I think we're going to come back again and again to these same questions. So those of you who had questions earlier, we'll give you a chance. Let me introduce the final, I think 4 speakers actually. First of all, Joe Kuhn. Schun, sorry, I knew I would mispronounce it, is a lecturer of modern history at the University of Essex, which is in a wonderful place. And I will ask her to speak first, followed by Nicholas Worth, research director at CNRS's Institut d'Histoire du Temps Présent. He has published so many books, it's hard to say. I know that my first encounter with Worth was discussing who is this person who wrote To Be Communist Under Stalin, an old book which is still worth going back to. It's a fabulous book, and he's one of my favorite historians. And then Kimberly Manning from Concordia will speak, as well as I believe Sandra Fahy, who works on North Korea and is at Sophia University in Tokyo. So please, Joe. Sorry for the
Thank you, Lynn. I just want to follow up, pick up on our early conversation on public commemoration, why there is no public commemoration of the Great Leap Famine in China. In addition to what Lucien and Kimberly has said, one important thing I want to say is what the Communist Party in China sell to the people in China is stability. It's stability that gives the Communist Party, the power. Yeah, continue. It's that card they play, the stability card, made it possible for the Communist Party continue to rule in China. And the famine destabilizes. The memory of the famine destabilizes. So that is why there is no public commemoration of famine in China. Then there is the other side of story. It's the famine survivors themselves. I have interviewed, when I was researching, I interviewed more than 200 people over the 5 years throughout China. And most people I've spoken to did not want to remember the famine. When I asked them, to talk about the famine, they quite often broken down, and then they will say, "No, I don't want to remember it. It's too bitter. It's too hard. It's too humiliating." And then the interesting thing is, so in a situation like that, I just keep silent, and I said, "That's fine, not to worry. Cry if you want to." And then after a while, they calm down. Then they start speaking non-stop. I realized, for many of them, this is a form of social healing. For after 50 years, it's the first time they actually managed to talk about it to somebody who is a stranger. They were not able to talk to their children about it because they don't want their children to carry the burden. And also, it's inappropriate for many of them. Actually, told me that it's inappropriate to talk about it because it stops them to move on, to carry on. It's part of survival in order to move on, to carry on, because it's too painful. And so it's better to, leave it behind and to move on in life. This is something I want to, propose to all of you to think about, is how and why painful memory are delayed or suppressed. I think that's what's good. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I think I learned a lot at this conference, and I won't go into the differences and similarities because a lot has been said, and I agree about this. I would just like to give some methodological comments because, the subjects, topics were different, but the historic methodology is the same. And of course, we've learned a tremendous amount in the past 20 or 30 years about the state planning, the political decision making, the top-down chain of orders coming from the top to the provinces. All this is now well documented, and but a series of problems remain under-researched, and so what was going at a micro level, who exactly took what in villages. So all these classic problems which have been very well dealt, well, for example, in Nazi historiography, works like Jan Gross on the neighbors, all this, I think there's still a lot of things to research in this area. And this is why I think it's so important some of the work which is being done, well, Professor Joe, for example, for collecting oral testimonies, oral history. I haven't done much about oral history, except for last small book I wrote, which was more, well, a kind of diary when I went to the Colima 2 years ago and tried to have a testimonies of people who stayed there after their experience of the Gulag, but not only detainees, but also people who worked in the apparatus of a Dalstroy, and it was, for me, really something very new to try and make some, well, very amateur but oral history, and I realized how much this gave me after the work I had done in the archives of the system, well, the Gulag archives in Moscow. And so I think that all these areas are still worth researching. Of course, it is a bit late for, well, the famine of the 1930 and that's why it was such important that all these testimonies had been collected in the, well, very early in the 1950s and 70s and 80s, and now we start to have a general picture with both the archives, both the documents from the central and local apparatus, but still lots of things to know about. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you again to the organizers for this opportunity to participate in this series of discussions over the last 2 days. Yesterday I spoke as a political scientist when I gave remarks on the panel I was sitting on, but I feel like I really wear two hats. I'm someone who studies Chinese politics, but I also study gender and politics. And for these last few moments that I have, I would really like to highlight for just a few areas with respect to gender. I feel like there have been some brief mentions over the last 2 days, but I really would argue that, in fact, both the production and consumption of famine, or how it's experienced, is a highly gendered phenomenon. And I know that there's been some wonderful work done on the Soviet famines with respect to gender, and I just want to highlight very quickly some of the emerging findings from China with respect to this, because I think there's some very interesting new work being done in this area. First of all, I'd just like to say that the Great Leap Forward, which precipitated the famine itself, could not have happened without its highly gendered framework, and that is the mobilization of women into quote-unquote productive work. And this was 50 to 60% of women to 90% of women working in the fields within a very, very short period of time. Women, in fact, were primarily responsible for taking in the harvest, for example, while large retinues of men were mobilized outside of the villages. Now, some women went too as well, and I'll just mention that briefly in a minute. But With respect to the experiences of famine, I just want to mention a couple of things. Ralph Thaxton, for example, mentioned the selling of sex, for example, the way cadres use that as a way in which to control or wield power over women. Migration itself was highly gendered. We see a tremendous breakdown of families during famine, and a huge spike in divorces in particular in 1961-62 that was unprecedented since the early 1950s. There were health issues. Women working, forced to work shortly after giving birth. There was a huge breakout of prolapsed uterus. Women experience the condition of prolapsed uterus and other really horrific kinds of health conditions. And I would also add, women were responsibilized also for food consumption. So again, as I was mentioning yesterday, there was a great emphasis that, if there was not enough to eat, mothers in particular were made responsible for that. You haven't done a good enough job economizing. Now, of course, most families were eating in the dining halls at this time, but even so, there was a sense in which, or ways in which women were still being made responsible. So there are many ways in which, as women were very much implicated and experienced the famine perhaps in different ways than men. But I would also add, too, that that women were also participants in and responsible for how the famine took place as well, and that is women leaders in particular. And in my own work, it's very clear that at the highest level of the party, one woman, the head of the All China Women's Federation, was very responsible for undertaking the rectification of the women's movement and backing Mao at every turn, and in fact developing the policy of the two diligences, which was this policy to emphasize thrift. So in that sense, but then also at the grassroots. Young women, for example, who responded to the deeply, for some women, what was a deeply exciting moment, an opportunity to potentially leave the village and work on these work sites. Women who were thrilled at the prospect of becoming activists. And of course, there were other women who were not. But these were very complicated processes, and I think when you bring up the issue of needing to look at these microprocesses, I think gender is a really, really important aspect of this that we just can't neglect as we move forward in our scholarship, both in our particular areas and comparatively as well.
Would you like to step up to this microphone? Or come to the end? Yes, sure. Sandra Fine.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sandra Fahy. I've actually somewhat crashed the conference, I guess, because I'm a North Korean expert based in Tokyo, Japan. I did work with North Korean survivors of the 1990s famine. These were people who had defected through China to Seoul, South Korea, and Tokyo, Japan. There's some also based in Osaka. Gosh, there's so much that I can say because the situation of the famine in North Korea is in some ways like a sibling to these communist famines, and in other ways it's its own kind of aberration. Gender, as you mentioned, is a huge aspect. 70% of North Korean defectors are women. The sexual violence against women is a big issue in North Korea. A lot of it's related to the famine as well. Sexual exploitation of women. There's so many things I could say. I haven't actually prepared to be part of this. It's just trying to gather my thoughts here a bit. Well, I'll say that my book is coming out from Columbia University Press next year, and I would encourage you to take a look, because what it addresses is a contemporary case of these phenomenon. It looks at survivors' accounts, and it tries to contextualize them, how North Koreans understood what was happening to them, how much they absorbed the state's interpretation of things, and what precipitated their defection. Why did they leave? How did they conceptualize the state after the fact? how do they feel now that they're in places like South Korea, which is, technically the enemy state to North Korea, or Japan, even worse. And then the final thing I'd like to say is that it's very important that we consider, as Vin mentioned at the beginning, these things in historical and geopolitical context. The reason that North Korea holds on so fiercely, despite the fact that its population is starving to this day as I speak, there's a food crisis in North Korea that's been going on since the early 90s. The reason North Korea refuses to change its policy is because that it would, as it sees it, be absorbed by South Korea. It sees North Korea as an enemy colonized state. It sees China as a threat, though also its friend. So there are a lot of forces pressing on the state to create this context and this situation, and the people are the ones who suffer because they're not valuable or important to the state. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, we can go back to one or two quick questions. And I just want to say that that's an extraordinary source of interviews. So.
Did what needed to be done.
Yes, please identify yourself.
Hello, good afternoon. Research Institute. I'm wondering about sort of a pivotal characteristic of internal colonialism, bringing back to the issue of empire and hunger. I'm looking for some sort of a yardstick that could be applied to various regions within the Soviet Union as well as China, to see which one would, meet those characteristics. To see, and then see for look for pattern and what internal colonies famine occurred or did not occur, and why so. I would say that obviously in this case of the Soviet famines, Kazakhstan seems to be, fairly easy case to make. Ukraine maybe not as obvious, but has a very strong case as well. I'm not that familiar with China, but I assume that also the regional differences would merit more or less in that regard. So can we, and panelists, anyone, just give sort of basic sense? What is that? What regions would be more likely to categorize at that time?
Yeah, I'd like to put that on the agenda, actually, for further consideration. I don't think we have time for it now. We have two more brief questions. Please identify yourselves.
I'm Ira Vinska. I'm first of all very glad that the topic of oral history was brought up, and I understand what you were saying, because I went through exactly the same with interviewing Ukrainian Holodomor survivors, and I've been doing it for the past 30 years. My question is, does anyone do anything on the effects of the second generation, on the children of Holodomor survivors? I know there is a great deal done on the children on the second and third generation of Holocaust survivors, but is any work being done on the second generation of the famine survivors?
Anyone know of anything? In China?
Well, there is, until now there isn't anything, but we are doing that now. In October, I'm actually going to train some high school teachers from rural China and to involve their students in oral history project. So they were going back to interview their grandparents and the elders in the village about the experience of the famine.
Upon reading about the Ukrainian famine, Holodomor, one aspect that struck me strongly was the fact that food was forcibly taken from people, and often people were shot for trying to forage for food. Was this prevalent in the other famines in Kazakhstan and in China?
This was certainly this was certainly the case in China, as my book, The Documentary History, shows that food was used as weapon. Kind of people, many people were deprived, deprived food. It was not because they were starving, not because there was not enough food, but they were deprived of food. If you did not work hard enough on the construction site or in farming field, then your work points will be deducted. Then you will have no food to eat.
I want to thank you all for your patience. We probably could have gone on for another hour, but Andrea is getting more and more nervous looking at me, so
It's not true.
So, not you.